Mayday, mayday, mayday. The frantic calls echoed across the airwaves. Coast Guard, get all emergency equipment out to the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge is down. This is a mayday emergency situation. Stop the traffic on that Skyway Bridge. It was May 9th, 1980. A massive bulk carrier was navigating eastbound through Tampa Bay's bound shipping channel, heading for the port of Tampa. Harbor pilot John Lerro and his co-pilot trainee, Bruce Atkins, were tasked with guiding the MV Summit Venture beneath the twin spans of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. What if, beneath the calm surface, a critical vulnerability lay hidden, waiting for the perfect storm to expose it? That morning, no severe thunderstorm warning had been issued for Tampa Bay's shipping traffic. However, the latest advisory from the National Weather Service was already several hours old, and conditions in the bay were rapidly deteriorating. Above them, 35 people were crossing the bridge, completely unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold. At the entrance to the bay, control of the ship had been handed over to John Lerro, a standard procedure. Large vessels transiting Tampa Bay were required to use local harbor pilots, experienced mariners intimately familiar with the channel's unique quirks and hazards. To reach the port, the MV Summit Venture had to follow a precisely marked path through the bay, guided by a line of navigation buoys, and pass directly beneath the bridge. There was almost no room for last-minute course corrections. At 185, 6 meters in length, the Summit Venture required nearly 6 kilometers to come to a complete stop in those worsening conditions. Despite the conflicting weather reports, Lerro maintained course, but what happened next would transform the vulnerable steel structure into a 7-meter free fall. The bridge itself wasn't without warning signs. Records indicate that between 1969 and 1980, the Sunshine Skyway had already experienced 10 waterborne vessel-related incidents. The original bridge, opened in 1954, saw a second span added in 1971 to accommodate growing traffic. Both were steel cantilever bridges supported by concrete columns, and at the time of its opening, it was one of the longest bridges in Florida. However, the Skyway had a critical vulnerability. It was built to withstand the weight of traffic, but never designed to absorb the impact from 20,000 metric tons of steel. It lacked a proper structural pier protection system. While the original plans did show 3 wooden pile dolphins on each side of cut a channel to protect the main shipping lane piers, by 1980, they had either rotted away or been destroyed and were never replaced. The concrete columns stood in the water completely unprotected. Lerro himself wasn't a stranger to maritime incidents. Records showed he had been involved in several minor events during his 42-month tenure as a Tampa Bay harbor pilot. This included an incident less than 3 months before the disaster when the stern of a 219.5-meter freighter he was piloting nudged the bridge, causing $40,000 in damage. Yet none of those prior incidents had truly tested the bridge's structural integrity, and through all of them, Lerro had never been found at fault. That was until now. At 7:20 a.m., the Summit Venture was inbound through Mullet Key Channel, with Lerro at the controls, steering for the bridge opening. As the rain began to intensify, he reduced speed to half ahead and continuously adjusted course to compensate for wind and current, striving to stay aligned with the channel markers. But without any warning, at 7:23 a.m., a line of intense thunderstorms violently struck Tampa Bay. The storm unleashed a sudden rain squall and powerful winds undetectable by instruments at the time. The rain intensified with such ferocity, creating a solid wall of blinding water that dropped visibility to practically zero. The timing couldn't have been worse. The bridge was completely obscured by the deluge. The crew turned to radar, only to find that the precipitation was so dense it rendered the Summit Venture's radar systems useless. Filling the screen with rain clutter and obscuring navigational targets, a trio of lookouts had gone to the bow to watch for the markers, but they were unable to identify the navigation buoys amidst the torrent. The junction ahead required an 18-degree turn into Cut A Channel just 3 kilometers from the bridge, far too close to allow a safe abort for large inbound vessels if the turn was not properly executed. But because the Summit Venture's cargo holds were empty, the ship rode high in the water and her 185.6-meter hull acted like a massive sail. Near hurricane-force winds of 111 kilometers per hour began pushing the 20,000 metric ton freighter south. The least risk option now was an immediate hard turn to starboard, as a turn toward port risked a collision with an outbound pure oil tanker approaching from the opposite direction. But convinced the increased wind could push the Summit Venture sideways into the bridge during a starboard turn, Lerro hesitated. Then, when the buoys briefly reappeared on radar and a lookout called one off the starboard bow, he attempted course corrections to realign the ship instead. Over the next few minutes, the storm only intensified. At 7:31 a.m., he ordered the ship's speed to slow ahead. At this point, the Summit Venture was already off course. Instead of heading for the open center span, it was veering directly toward one of the bridge's concrete supports. Lerro, however, didn't realize this until the bridge suddenly emerged through the rain, nearly 244 meters from where they expected it to be. He immediately ordered the engines into full reverse and for the anchors to be dropped. But it was too late. The bow of the MV Summit Venture struck Anchor Pier 2S of the southbound span of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge at 7:34 a.m., triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. Approximately 3 meters of the southbound span collapsed into Tampa Bay, pulling a pickup truck and 2 other vehicles down with it. Up on the bridge, drivers had no idea the roadway ahead was gone, and there was no immediate way to warn them. 4 sedans and a Greyhound bus drove off the broken span, roughly 110 to 160 seconds after the collapse, and plunged 7 meters into the water below. In less than 4 seconds, they hit the water with the force of a crash into concrete. One driver, nearing the crest of the bridge, realized the upper superstructure was missing and managed to stop just 6 centimeters from the edge. He and his 3 passengers quickly exited their vehicle and began warning other drivers. Meanwhile, aboard the Summit Venture, nearly 4 meters of collapsed roadway crashed down onto the ship. Remarkably, the lone lookout who had remained at the bow survived by ducking between 2 large stanchions as the wreckage came to rest only centimeters above his head. Less than 9 meters away, the northbound span remained untouched. Immediately after the collision, Lerro broadcast a mayday to the Coast Guard. Approximately 1 minute after the collapse, the National Weather Service finally issued a severe weather warning for mariners, but by then it was already too late. Within half an hour, the storm had passed. The rescue effort quickly became a recovery operation. Coast Guard crews, sheriff's deputies, and rescue divers arrived on scene, but the results were grim. Of the 9 vehicles that went over the edge, only 1 person managed to resurface. Wesley McIntyre, a 56-year-old pickup driver, had fallen with the bridge, but his truck struck the hull of the Summit Venture on the way down, likely reducing the impact. He managed to escape the sinking truck and swim to the surface, where the crew pulled him to safety. The other 35 people who fell from the bridge were still missing. 26 of them were aboard a Greyhound bus traveling south for Mother's Day weekend. Recovering the victims took almost a week. The wreckage was so badly twisted that it required explosives to break apart and cranes to lift the vehicles to the surface. As the recovery continued, bodies began washing up on nearby beaches and in the mangroves. When the Greyhound bus was finally recovered, its roof had been ripped open almost end to end from the sheer force of the crash. The investigation that followed would determine who was actually responsible. A special panel revoked Lerro's harbor pilot license, stating that his actions amounted to incompetence and neglect, and that he had taken no action to halt the ship, change its course, or drop anchors until the vessel was in immediate peril of striking the bridge. The Neats concluded the disaster was caused by a combination of sudden severe weather, the failure to issue a timely severe weather warning for mariners, and Lerro's delayed reaction. It also found that large vessels were not separated into one-way traffic near the bridge, and there was no final checkpoint to confirm a ship was still lined up for the span. But what made the collapse even deadlier was the lack of impact protection around the bridge piers and the absence of a warning system for motorists. Lerro was later reinstated, cleared of negligence, and criminal charges were never filed. The investigation also noted that he had received favorable weather reports from other ships in the area. Even so, Lerro never forgave himself for what happened. Wesley McIntyre, the only person who survived the fall, later sued the company that owned the ship and settled for $175,000 in 1984. He carried the weight of being the sole survivor for the rest of his life and died of bone cancer in 1989 at the age of 65. Construction on a replacement bridge began in 1982, and the new Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened in 1987. It was built with massive protective concrete dolphins around the piers, a wider channel, and a warning system designed to close the bridge in dangerous conditions. The redesign proved itself almost immediately. Shortly after the new bridge opened, a shrimp boat struck the protective bumpers head-on. The boat sank, and the bridge was completely unaffected. 35 people died on the morning of May 9, 1980, in what remains one of the worst bridge disasters in the history of the United States.